Ethan Zhang never imagined that a routine drive home would turn into one of the most humiliating and transformative nights of his life. On a cold winter evening, he found himself face to face with the very abuse of power he had spent years trying to reform. Forced out of his car under the pretense of a broken taillight, Ethan was pushed to his limits, not just as a city councilman, but as a human being. What began as a routine traffic stop quickly escalated into a shocking display of unchecked authority. Humiliated in front of bystanders and subjected to unreasonable demands, Ethan endured in silence, refusing to reveal his identity as a leader of police oversight. Little did the officers know their actions that night would ignite a movement that would transform not only their lives but the entire city of Northpoint. Before we dive into this gripping tale of justice, resilience, and redemption, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you enjoy powerful stories like this one, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss what's next. Ethan Zhang rubbed his tired eyes as he drove his sleek black Toyota Camry through the empty streets of downtown Northpoint. The digital clock on his dashboard blinked at 11:45 p.m., and the temperature gauge read a bone-chilling 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow had begun falling gently, blanketing the roads in a thin, icy sheen. Ethan sighed, grateful for the warmth of his car's heater as it pushed back the freezing cold outside. The evening had been grueling. As chairman of the city council's finance committee, Ethan had just wrapped up a tense 5-hour budget meeting. Discussions had been particularly heated when the police department requested additional funds for military-grade equipment. Ethan had fiercely opposed it, arguing that the money would be better spent on community programs and officer training. The resistance from certain council members and police representatives had left him drained but resolute. As he navigated through the quiet streets, Ethan found himself looking forward to the comfort of home. His wife, Lena, would likely have left a warm dinner waiting for him in the microwave. The thought of sinking into his favorite armchair with a hot meal and maybe a book brought a small, tired smile to his face. His house was only 15 minutes away now, and the idea of stepping into its cozy warmth kept him going. Suddenly, a flash of red and blue lights illuminated his rearview mirror, startling Ethan out of his thoughts. He glanced at the speedometer. He was driving exactly at the speed limit. Confused but calm, he flicked on his turn signal and pulled over under a streetlight, just as his father, a retired police officer, had always advised. Ethan came to a complete stop and turned off the engine, his breath forming small clouds as he exhaled. 2 police officers approached his car, one on each side. Their flashlights beamed directly into his windows, making it nearly impossible for him to see their faces. The officer on the driver's side rapped sharply on the window, even as Ethan was already rolling it down. The nameplate on the officer's chest read Cooper, and his brusque tone carried an unnecessary edge of authority. "License and registration," Officer Cooper demanded, without so much as a greeting. "Good evening, officer," Ethan replied politely, reaching slowly for his wallet. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" The second officer, Harris, shifted his stance, his hand casually resting on the holster of his firearm. The unspoken threat in his posture wasn't lost on Ethan. "Your right taillight is out," Cooper replied, his tone cold and detached. Ethan frowned slightly, his fingers pausing over his wallet. He had just had his car serviced the previous week. "I don't believe that's the case, officer. I had my car checked recently, and everything was working fine." Cooper straightened, puffing out his chest in a clear display of authority. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." The sharpness of the command made Ethan's heart skip a beat. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "Officer, it's freezing outside, and I don't see," I said. "Step out of the vehicle." Cooper's voice boomed through the icy night, loud enough to wake a few nearby residents. Lights flickered on in apartment windows above, and silhouettes appeared, peering down at the scene. Ethan knew his rights. He also knew that refusing to comply would likely escalate the situation. As a council member, he had heard countless complaints of police misconduct, but experiencing it firsthand was an entirely different reality. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out into the bitter cold. The icy wind cut through his tailored suit like a blade, and snowflakes clung to his shoulders. Ethan's polished leather shoes crunched against the snow-covered pavement, sending a chill up his spine. "Hands where we can see them," Harris ordered, his flashlight tracking Ethan's every move. Raising his hands slightly, Ethan complied. Despite the humiliation of the situation, he remained calm and dignified. It was then he noticed something chilling. Both officers' body cameras were turned off. A surge of anger and fear coursed through him. This was a clear violation of protocol and an unmistakable sign that whatever came next wouldn't be by the book. Officer Cooper circled Ethan like a predator, his boots crunching on the snow. The streetlight above cast long shadows, giving the scene an almost surreal quality. Above, several of the curious onlookers had started recording the encounter with their phones. "So, you think you know more than a police officer?" Cooper sneered, his breath forming misty clouds in the frigid air. Ethan met his gaze steadily. "No, sir. I only wanted to point out that there might be a misunderstanding." "Oh, a misunderstanding?" Cooper stopped directly in front of Ethan, his face mere inches away. "You rich types think you're above the law, don't you?" Ethan didn't respond. His corporate training in de-escalation was serving him well, even as the temperature seemed to plummet further. His fingers were already numb, and his polished dress shoes were woefully inadequate for standing in the snow. "Prove it then," Cooper said, a sly grin spreading across his face. "Drop and give me 20 push-ups. Right here, right now." For a moment, Ethan thought he had misheard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Cooper replied, resting a hand casually on his taser. "Consider it a lesson in humility. Unless you'd prefer we search your vehicle?" Harris laughed, pulling out his personal phone to record. The threat was unmistakable. Ethan glanced down at the snow-covered pavement and then back at the two officers. He could feel the weight of the onlookers' eyes and the phones recording from above. Slowly he knelt, his suit pants soaking through almost instantly as his knees hit the icy ground. Placing his hands on the frozen pavement, he began. 1, 2, 3. Each push-up felt like a test of both endurance and pride. The icy pavement beneath Ethan Zhang's palms was unrelenting, numbing his hands and sending sharp chills through his body. His tailored suit, once immaculate, was now soaked through, its navy fabric darkened by melting snow and slush. Each descent brought his chest closer to the ground, his tie dragging through the frozen muck, a sharp contrast to the polished confidence he had exuded just hours earlier in the city council chambers. 4, 5, 6. Ethan counted aloud, his voice steady despite the humiliation clawing at his composure. Officer Harris circled him, phone in hand, recording the spectacle with obvious amusement. "This is what happens when people think they're smarter than the law," Harris said mockingly, his laughter echoing in the cold night air. Above them, more lights flicked on in the surrounding buildings, and more silhouettes appeared in windows. Some of the onlookers had begun filming with their phones, their voices faint but audible over the wind. Ethan kept his focus on the ground, his breath coming out in short, visible puffs as he pushed himself up and down. His body ached, and the cold was seeping into his bones, but his mind was already racing. He took note of every detail. Cooper's smirk, Harris's phone, the absence of their body cameras, and the onlookers recording from the safety of their apartments. 7, 8. His voice wavered slightly as his arms began to tremble from both the exertion and the freezing temperatures. "Not bad for a guy in a fancy suit," Cooper sneered, stepping closer to Ethan. The officer loomed over him, his shadow stretching across the icy pavement. "Maybe we should make it 30. What do you think, Harris?" 30 sounds fair," Harris replied with a chuckle, still holding his phone aloft. Ethan didn't flinch. He continued his push-ups, refusing to let the officers see his anger or frustration. He knew that any sign of defiance could escalate the situation further, and he couldn't risk that, not for himself and not for the community he served. 28, 29, 30. Ethan's voice was firm as he completed the final push-up, his arms shaking as he pushed himself upright. His knees ached from kneeling on the frozen ground, and his soaked suit clung uncomfortably to his body. As he began to rise, something slipped from the inside pocket of his jacket and landed softly on the pavement. It was his wallet. The leather cover flipped open as it hit the ground, revealing the gold-embossed seal of the city council. Harris's laughter died abruptly. Cooper," he muttered, his tone suddenly uneasy. He lowered his phone and shone his flashlight on the wallet. Cooper stepped forward, his earlier smugness evaporating as his eyes landed on the council ID card displayed inside the wallet. The name and title were unmistakable. Ethan Zhang. City council member, chairman of the police oversight committee. The realization hit them like a gust of freezing wind. The man they had just humiliated wasn't just another civilian. He was someone with authority, someone who could hold them accountable. "Sir, we didn't realize," Cooper stammered, his previous confidence replaced by palpable fear. He bent down to pick up the wallet and extended it toward Ethan with a trembling hand. "Please accept my apologies." Ethan ignored the outstretched wallet for a moment, brushing off the slush from his knees and straightening his tie as best he could. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft crunch of snow under Harris's boots as he shifted uncomfortably. "You didn't realize?" Ethan's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made both officers flinch. He took the wallet from Cooper, dusting off the snow with deliberate precision. "Sir, it was just a misunderstanding," Harris blurted, his earlier bravado completely gone. He was now frantically tapping on his phone, clearly attempting to delete the video he had been recording. Ethan's gaze snapped to Harris. "I wouldn't delete that if I were you," he said quietly, his tone carrying more weight than a shout. "Destroying evidence is a serious offense." Harris froze, his hand hovering over the screen of his phone. Bookmark. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. Cooper and Harris, who had loomed over Ethan minutes earlier, now stood awkwardly in the snow, looking more like chastened schoolboys than seasoned police officers. "You have until 9 a.m. tomorrow to submit detailed reports about this incident," Ethan continued, his voice steady but commanding. "Include everything. Why you stopped me, why your body cameras were off, and why you thought it was appropriate to make me do push-ups in freezing weather during a routine traffic stop." "Sir, if we could just," Cooper began, but Ethan raised a hand, cutting him off. "Good night, gentlemen," Ethan said, his tone final. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, his shoes squishing against the slushy pavement with each step. The warmth of the heater enveloped him as he slid into the driver's seat, but it did little to chase away the chill that had settled into his bones. Through the rearview mirror, he watched as Cooper and Harris stood motionless under the streetlight, their figures stark against the falling snow. They looked lost, their earlier arrogance reduced to stunned silence. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts racing. What had just transpired wasn't merely an insult to him personally. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that he had fought against for years, but had never fully experienced until now. As he drove away, the digital clock on his dashboard ticked over to 12:30 a.m. He was no longer thinking about the warm meal waiting for him at home or the exhaustion weighing on his body. Instead, his mind was already formulating a plan. This wasn't over. The heater in Ethan Zhang's car roared at full blast, but it barely warmed him. His soaked suit clung to his body, his fingers trembled on the steering wheel, and the lingering sting of humiliation gnawed at his mind. As he drove through the eerily quiet streets of Northpoint, his thoughts replayed the night's events like a broken record. The laughter of Officer Harris, the cold bite of the pavement, and the unbearable weight of being forced to do push-ups under the gaze of mocking authority haunted him. His tie was still damp and speckled with dirt, a visible reminder of what he had endured. He glanced at the passenger seat, where his phone vibrated incessantly with notifications. He knew it was Lena, his wife, wondering why he hadn't come home yet. Normally, he would answer right away, but tonight, he couldn't bring himself to pick up. How could he explain what had happened? How could he admit to her, someone who saw him as a pillar of strength, that he had been treated like a mere pawn in a power game by the very people he was supposed to oversee? At a red light, Ethan caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. His usually composed face looked worn, older than his 45 years. His wet hair clung to his forehead, and dark circles underlined his sharp brown eyes. He exhaled deeply, gripping the steering wheel harder. "This can't go unchallenged," he muttered to himself. "Not anymore." His phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from a local news outlet. A headline appeared on the lock screen. City Councilman Ethan Zhang forced to do push-ups in snow during traffic stop. Attached was a video, likely uploaded by one of the bystanders. Ethan clicked the link, his heart sinking as he watched the grainy footage. The video showed him in sharp detail, his suit scraping the icy ground, as Harris's laughter rang out in the background. Within minutes, the clip had amassed thousands of views, with comments ranging from outrage to disbelief. "This is bigger than me," Ethan realized. Turning onto his street, Ethan finally allowed his mind to shift from what had happened to what he could do about it. He pulled into his driveway, leaving the car running as he grabbed his briefcase from the back seat. Inside was his tablet, and with practiced efficiency, he opened it and began typing. Subject: Emergency Meeting Notice. To Police Oversight Committee members. Time: 9:30 a.m. tomorrow. Location: City Council Chambers. Agenda: Review of recent police conduct and departmental policies. Attendance: mandatory. After sending the email, Ethan placed a call to Mary, his assistant, who picked up despite the late hour. "Mary," he said, his voice steadier now, "I need every civilian complaint filed against Officers Cooper and Harris from the past 5 years on my desk by 8 a.m. "Understood," Mary replied, sensing the urgency in his tone. "And contact the Traffic Control Department," Ethan continued. "Get me all footage from the intersection of Park Avenue and 5th Street between 11:45 p.m. and 12:30 a.m. tonight. Also, I'll need the police department's body camera compliance reports for the past 6 months. Anything else?" Mary asked. "Yes," Ethan said after a pause. "Thank you, Mary. Get some rest when you can." The call ended, but Ethan's resolve only deepened. There was one more call he had to make, one that carried both personal and professional weight. The phone rang 3 times before his father's familiar voice answered. "Ethan," said Captain Zhang, a retired police officer and a man Ethan had long admired. His father's tone, still sharp at 70, carried the wisdom of decades on the force. "What's wrong, son?" Ethan hesitated, then began recounting the events of the night. He spared no details, describing the taillight excuse, the body cameras being off, and the humiliating push-ups in the snow. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I always told you," Captain Zhang said finally, "power can corrupt even the best intentions. But the real question is, what are you going to do about it?" Ethan looked down at his hands, raw and red from the icy pavement, then at his ruined suit and the council badge on the seat beside him. "I'm going to do what should have been done years ago," he replied. "It's time to clean house." "Good," his father said, his voice firm. "Remember, Ethan, this isn't just about punishment. It's about fixing the system." The call ended, but the words lingered. Ethan finally turned off the car and stepped out into the freezing night. The porch light was on, as always, a small beacon welcoming him home. Inside, the house was silent, except for the faint hum of the heater. Lena had fallen asleep on the couch, a throw blanket draped over her shoulders. Ethan paused for a moment, watching her peaceful expression, and felt a pang of guilt for the worry he knew she'd feel when she learned about the night's events. Carefully, he covered her with the blanket and kissed her forehead before heading to his study. Sleep wasn't an option tonight. He had work to do, and tomorrow would be the start of a battle that would change not just his life, but the future of Northpoint's police force. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the city in silence, but for Ethan Zhang, it was the quiet before the storm. At exactly 7 a.m., Ethan Zhang walked into City Hall, his stride purposeful and his face set with determination. He looked every bit the professional councilman, wearing a sharp black suit with a crimson tie, his signature look for important meetings. If not for the faint bags under his eyes and the stiffness in his gait from the night before, no one would have guessed the humiliation he had endured just hours earlier. The security guard at the entrance did a double take. Ethan was never this early, and the hard look in his eyes suggested this wasn't just another workday. Ethan offered a curt nod before continuing down the hallway toward his office, where his assistant Mary was already waiting. Mary had dark circles under her eyes and a steaming cup of coffee in her hand, the kind of visual proof Ethan had expected. Her desk was neatly organized, 5 stacks of papers arranged in perfect order. "Good morning, Mr. Zhang," Mary greeted, standing as he entered. "I have everything you requested." Officers Cooper and Harris have had 19 complaints filed against them in the past 5 years. None of them were properly investigated. Ethan's brow furrowed as he flipped through the topmost stack. Each document told a similar story. Citizens claiming harassment, excessive force, or inappropriate behavior, followed by vague responses from the department citing lack of evidence or resolved internally. "These patterns are unacceptable," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to Mary. "And the body camera compliance reports?" he asked, setting down the complaints. Mary handed him another stack. In the last 6 months, both officers reported their cameras malfunctioning 13 times. That's more than 3 times the department average. Ethan's lips tightened. This was worse than he had anticipated, and yet it confirmed everything he had heard from frustrated citizens over the years. The system wasn't just broken, it was deliberately neglected. "Anything from the traffic cameras at Park and 5th? Ethan asked. "Yes, sir." Mary passed him a flash drive. Footage from 11:45 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. shows everything: the stop, the interaction, and the push-ups. Her voice faltered slightly at the last word, but she recovered quickly. "It's all there." Ethan nodded. "Good work, Mary." "Thank you." As Mary stepped out to give him a moment alone, Ethan opened his laptop and reviewed the traffic footage. The angles were clear, showing Cooper and Harris stopping his car, ordering him out, and demanding push-ups while laughing. It was irrefutable evidence, and Ethan knew it would play a central role in today's meeting. At 8:45 a.m., the 2 officers in question arrived at his office. Their usual confidence seemed diminished in the daylight. Cooper fidgeted nervously, and Harris avoided Ethan's gaze entirely. Both were dressed in their full uniforms, a stark contrast to their casual arrogance the night before. Ethan didn't offer them a seat. He simply extended his hand. "Your reports." The officers handed over their paperwork, their hands shaking slightly. Ethan scanned the documents briefly. As expected, both officers tried to downplay the incident. Cooper described the stop as a routine field sobriety test, while Harris claimed Ethan had volunteered to do the exercises. Ethan closed the reports with a snap. "Save your explanations for the committee meeting," he said evenly. "It starts in 45 minutes. I suggest you both prepare." Cooper opened his mouth to respond, but Ethan's cold stare silenced him. The 2 officers retreated from the office, leaving Ethan to finalize his preparations. At 9:25 a.m., Ethan walked into the main council chamber. The large room was packed, buzzing with the kind of tense energy reserved for high-stakes events. Every seat was filled, and dozens of citizens stood along the walls. Local news cameras lined the back of the room, their lenses trained on the council table at the front. The police chief, a burly man named Gerald Sims, sat in the front row. His face was a mix of embarrassment and anger, likely aimed as much at the 2 officers as at the unwanted media attention. Cooper and Harris sat nearby, looking uncomfortable in their dress uniforms. Ethan took his seat at the center of the table, spreading out the documents and flash drives in front of him. He adjusted his microphone and leaned in, his calm demeanor commanding the room's attention. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but firm. "Before we begin, I want to thank everyone for being here today. Committee members, citizens, and members of the press." The room quieted as Ethan continued. "Last night, I experienced something that many of you have shared with me over the years. I was stopped by 2 officers during what was described as a routine traffic stop. What followed was anything but routine." He pressed a button on the table in front of him, and the large screen behind him lit up. The traffic camera footage began to play, showing the incident from start to finish. The room watched in stunned silence as Ethan narrated. "These officers thought they were dealing with just another citizen," Ethan said, his voice growing stronger. "They thought they could humiliate me without consequences, and that is exactly the problem." The video ended, leaving the chamber in a heavy silence. Ethan scanned the room, making eye contact with the citizens who had raised similar concerns in the past. "This is not about 2 officers," he said. "This is about a culture that allows abuse of power to go unchecked. A culture that has eroded trust between our police department and the community it serves." He picked up a stack of papers and held them aloft. "Here are 19 complaints filed against officers Cooper and Harris in the past 5 years. Want to know how many were properly investigated? 0. Sims shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Cooper visibly shrank in his chair. Ethan placed the papers back on the table and folded his hands. Today, we're not just addressing what happened to me. We're addressing every complaint that was ignored, everyone that mysteriously malfunctioned, and every citizen who felt powerless in the face of authority. The room was silent, but the energy was electric. Everyone knew this meeting wasn't just another discussion. It was a turning point. Zhang sat at the center of the council chamber, the quiet tension hanging heavy in the air as he prepared to continue. All eyes were fixed on him, citizens, journalists, and city officials alike. The large screen behind him displayed a still image from the traffic camera footage. Ethan kneeling on the frozen pavement, his hands pressed to the icy ground, as officers Cooper and Harris loomed above him. "This," Ethan said, gesturing toward the image, "is what unchecked power looks like. And let me be clear, this isn't just about me. It's about every citizen who has been humiliated, intimidated, or ignored by those sworn to protect them." The police chief, Gerald Sims, shifted in his seat, his face reddening as murmurs rippled through the room. Officers Cooper and Harris sat a few rows behind him, their expressions a mix of discomfort and dread. Ethan continued, his voice steady but charged with purpose. Over the past 5 years, these 2 officers alone have had 19 complaints filed against them. Excessive force, harassment, intimidation, and every single one was dismissed without proper investigation. Why? Because our system has allowed it. He glanced at the stack of documents before him. Let me read you an excerpt from one of these complaints, filed by a local business owner 2 years ago. Clearing his throat, Ethan read aloud, "I was pulled over for a supposed broken taillight. Officer Cooper demanded that I step out of the car. When I questioned why, he became aggressive, calling me uncooperative and threatening to arrest me. I was forced to sit on the curb in front of my shop while customers watched, humiliated and helpless." Ethan set the paper down, meeting the eyes of several citizens in the audience. "Does this sound familiar to anyone here?" Slowly, hands began to rise. First a few, then dozens, until nearly half the room had their hands in the air. The journalists turned their cameras toward the crowd, capturing the raw emotion etched on the faces of those who had suffered similar treatment. Ethan's voice softened, but lost none of its intensity. "This has gone on for too long, and it stops today." Chief Sims cleared his throat and stood. "Mr. Zhang," he began, his voice measured but defensive, "with all due respect, this seems like a personal vendetta against 2 officers for one isolated incident. Are we really going to let one night dictate sweeping changes to our department?" Ethan turned to face him, his expression calm but unyielding. "One incident, Chief? Let's ask the room." He gestured toward the audience. "How many of you have experienced or witnessed similar incidents involving our police force? Raise your hand." More hands went up, the room now brimming with silent accusations. The weight of their collective experiences was undeniable, and even Sims couldn't ignore it. He sank back into his seat, avoiding eye contact. "This isn't a personal vendetta," Ethan said, his voice rising. "This is about systemic failure. It's about accountability, transparency, and restoring trust. And it's about making sure that what happened to me and to so many others never happens again." He pressed another button, and the screen behind him switched to a spreadsheet of data. "These are the police department's body camera compliance reports from the last 6 months. Officers Cooper and Harris reported their cameras malfunctioning 13 times, more than 3 times the department average." "Why is that, Chief Sims?" Sims looked uncomfortable but didn't respond. Ethan leaned forward. "The answer is simple, because they knew there would be no consequences. No one was watching. No one was holding them accountable. But that changes today." Ethan picked up another document and addressed the entire room. "This is a proposal for immediate police reform. It includes the following measures: mandatory body camera usage with daily compliance checks. Any officer found disabling or neglecting their camera without cause will face immediate suspension. Civilian oversight of all complaint investigations, ensuring transparency and fairness. De-escalation training is a core component of police education, with mandatory renewals every 2 years. Immediate suspension for any officer with substantiated complaints of misconduct, pending thorough review." The room erupted into murmurs as Ethan laid out his plan. Some citizens nodded in approval, while others whispered anxiously among themselves. One council member, an older woman named Janet Ford, raised her hand. "Mr. Zhang," she said, "this proposal is ambitious, but do you really believe it's feasible? Our police union is bound to resist." Ethan met her gaze. "Change is never easy, Miss Ford, but it's necessary. The police union may resist, but we cannot let fear of backlash dictate our actions. This isn't about politics, it's about justice." Another council member chimed in. "And what about Officers Cooper and Harris? What happens to them?" Ethan glanced toward the two officers, who looked smaller than they had the night before. "They have two choices," he said firmly. "They can resign immediately, or they can face a full investigation. Every complaint against them, every traffic stop they've conducted, every report they've filed, it will all be reviewed." The room fell silent as Ethan's words hung in the air. Cooper and Harris exchanged nervous glances. Harris wiped sweat from his brow despite the cool temperature in the chamber. Finally, Cooper spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll resign." A ripple of surprise spread through the audience, followed by murmurs of approval. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. A wise choice. Turning back to the council, he held up the reform proposal. "Committee members, it's time to vote. Last night showed us what happens when power goes unchecked. Today we have the chance to fix it." One by one, the council members raised their hands in support. The vote was unanimous. As Ethan gathered his papers, he noticed his father sitting quietly in the back of the room. The retired police captain gave him a small, approving nod. Sometimes, Ethan thought, the path to justice requires navigating through humiliation and hardship, and sometimes it starts with push-ups in the snow. By the time the council meeting adjourned, news of the vote had already begun to spread. Reporters swarmed City Hall, their cameras rolling, as they captured the reactions of citizens and council members. Ethan Zhang stood firm on the steps outside, his shoulders squared, and his voice calm as he addressed the crowd. "Today marks the beginning of a new era for our city," he declared. "Accountability is no longer optional. Transparency is no longer negotiable, and justice is no longer a privilege. It's a right for every citizen of Northpoint." The applause that followed was hesitant at first, but it grew louder as his words sank in. Ethan could feel the tide turning. This wasn't just about one meeting or one vote. It was the first step in a long journey toward real reform. Inside City Hall, Officers Cooper and Harris quietly handed in their resignation letters. Both men avoided eye contact with anyone as they left the building, their heads bowed low. Cooper's once confident swagger was gone, replaced by the tentative steps of someone unsure of his place in the world. In a way, Ethan felt a flicker of pity for them. Their actions had been unacceptable. But they were also products of a flawed system, a system that had failed to hold them accountable and allowed their behavior to fester unchecked. That system was now his responsibility to fix. Back in his office, Ethan sat down at his desk, his mind racing. His phone buzzed continuously with calls and messages, congratulations from colleagues, media inquiries, and messages of support from citizens. But one text message caught his attention. It was from his father, Captain Zhang. "You've taken the first step. Now comes the hard part. Proud of you, son." Ethan smiled faintly, the weight of his father's approval grounding him. The challenges ahead were daunting, but he felt ready to face them. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mary stepped in, holding a printout. "Mr. Zhang, you need to see this," she said, setting the paper on his desk. It was a list of complaints filed against other officers in the department. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of allegations of misconduct, many of them eerily similar to the complaints against Cooper and Harris. Excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation tactics, the list went on and on. "Chief Sims will need to answer for this," Ethan said, his voice firm. "We're not just dealing with two bad apples. The entire tree needs pruning." Mary hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There's something else," she said. "Several citizens have come forward with videos of similar incidents involving officers from other precincts. It seems like the momentum is spreading." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind working quickly. The viral video of his own encounter had been the spark, and now the fire was spreading. This was no longer just about Northpoint, it was becoming a movement. "Good," Ethan said finally. The more people speak out, the harder it will be to ignore. Later that afternoon, Ethan held a press conference on the steps of City Hall. The crowd had grown since the morning, with more citizens and journalists gathering to hear him speak. Last night, I was reminded of the power that comes with a badge, and the responsibility that should come with it. Ethan began. Our police officers are entrusted with the safety and well-being of our community, but when that trust is broken, it is our duty to hold them accountable. He held up the newly passed police reform proposal for the cameras to see. This is not the end of the conversation, it's the beginning. We are committed to creating a system where accountability is the norm, not the exception. Where body cameras are always on, where complaints are thoroughly investigated, and where officers are trained not just in law enforcement, but in compassion and de-escalation. The crowd erupted into applause, and Ethan paused, letting the sound wash over him. To the good officers of this city, he continued, his voice steady, we stand with you. We value your service and your dedication. But to those who abuse their power, let this be a warning. Your time is over. From the corner of his eye, Ethan noticed a woman in the crowd wiping away tears. It was Harris's wife. Her presence reminded him that every action had consequences, not just for those directly involved, but for their families as well. Despite her pain, she had come to witness the change her husband's actions had inadvertently sparked. By the end of the day, Ethan's reform proposal had made headlines across the state. The video of his ordeal, combined with the council's unanimous vote, had captured the attention of other cities facing similar issues. Calls began pouring in from municipal leaders wanting to learn more about Northpoint's new policies. Ethan sat in his office that evening, watching the local news coverage on a small television. Footage of the council meeting played alongside clips of the viral video, followed by interviews with citizens who expressed hope for the future. Mary knocked softly on the door, stepping in with a hesitant smile. "Mr. Zhang, you should see this." She handed him her phone, which displayed a social media post from a neighboring city. It showed a group of citizens protesting outside their own police department, holding signs that read, "We deserve accountability too, and justice for all." "It's spreading," Mary said, her voice tinged with amazement. Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on the screen. The ripple effect had begun. For the first time since the previous night, he allowed himself to feel a sense of accomplishment. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for now, he had made a difference. He glanced at the badge on his desk, the very symbol of the authority he was fighting to reform. It gleamed under the soft light, a reminder of both the burden and the opportunity he carried. "This is only the beginning," Ethan murmured to himself. 3 weeks had passed since the fateful night when Ethan Zhang knelt on frozen pavement, forced to do push-ups by officers Cooper and Harris. In that short time, Northpoint had undergone a transformation no one could have predicted. Ethan's police reform initiative was not only implemented, but had also sparked a larger movement. Other cities began to adopt similar measures, inspired by Northpoint's commitment to accountability and transparency. Community leaders reached out to Ethan for advice, and his inbox was flooded with emails from citizens sharing their stories of abuse and offering words of encouragement. But one email in particular stood out. It came from former Officer Cooper. Ethan leaned back in his office chair, reading the message carefully. In it, Cooper expressed regret for his actions and asked for a meeting. He admitted that his resignation had been the wake-up call he needed, and that he wanted to make amends, not just for his behavior, but also for the culture he had been a part of. At first, Ethan wasn't sure how to respond. Part of him wanted to dismiss the request outright. After all, Cooper's actions had been inexcusable. But another part of him, the part that believed in redemption and systemic change, saw an opportunity. After a brief exchange of emails, Ethan arranged to meet Cooper at a local coffee shop. The air was crisp that morning as Ethan walked into the small cafe. He spotted Cooper immediately, sitting in a corner booth, looking uncharacteristically subdued. Gone was the arrogant swagger Ethan remembered. In its place was a man who seemed weighed down by guilt. "Mr. Zhang," Cooper said, standing awkwardly as Ethan approached. "Ethan is fine," he replied, gesturing for Cooper to sit. The two men sat across from each other, the tension between them palpable. For a moment, neither spoke, the quiet hum of the cafe filling the silence. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," Cooper began, his voice low but sincere. "What I did that night, there's no excuse for it. I let my authority go to my head, and I crossed every line I swore to uphold." Ethan studied him carefully, searching for any trace of insincerity, but Cooper's eyes were steady, and his words carried the weight of genuine remorse. "What made you reach out?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone measured. Cooper hesitated, then sighed deeply. "Honestly? Losing my badge was a wake-up call. For years I thought I was untouchable, that the badge gave me the right to do whatever I wanted. But when I saw how my actions affected you, and when I realized how many others I'd treated the same way, it hit me. I wasn't serving my community. I was serving my ego." Ethan nodded slowly, letting Cooper's words sink in. "And what do you want from me now?" "I want to help," Cooper said earnestly. "I've been speaking with other former officers, and a lot of us have stories like mine. We joined the force with good intentions but got swept up in a toxic culture. I want to use my experience to help train new officers, to show them what not to do." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You think people will trust you after what you've done?" Cooper's face fell slightly, but he straightened his posture. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I do believe that if I can share my mistakes, it might stop someone else from making the same ones." The meeting lasted nearly an hour, and by the end of it, Ethan felt a cautious sense of optimism. Cooper's offer wasn't just an apology, it was a step toward healing a broken system from within. A week later, Cooper returned to City Hall, not as a police officer, but as a speaker at the newly revamped police academy. He shared his story with a group of recruits, describing the pitfalls of unchecked power and the importance of humility in law enforcement. His candor was met with mixed reactions. Some recruits listened intently, taking notes, while others eyed him with skepticism. But Ethan believed that even planting the seed of accountability was a victory. Soon after, Harris also reached out, following in Cooper's footsteps. Together, the two former officers began working with the academy, offering a unique perspective on the dangers of abusing authority. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to oversee the implementation of the reform policies. Body cameras were now mandatory for all officers, with daily checks to ensure compliance. A civilian oversight board was established to handle complaints, and de-escalation training became a cornerstone of the department's curriculum. The changes didn't come without resistance. The police union pushed back, accusing Ethan of targeting officers unfairly. Protests from certain factions arose, that with some calling the reforms anti-police. But Ethan remained steadfast. "This isn't about being for or against the police," he said during a televised interview. "This is about ensuring that every officer has the tools, training, and accountability needed to serve our community with integrity." The results spoke for themselves. Within 3 months, civilian complaints had dropped by 40%, and trust between the police and the community was beginning to rebuild. Neighborhoods that once feared patrol cars now welcomed officers who had undergone the new training. One evening, Ethan received a phone call from his father. "I heard about Cooper and Harris working at the academy," Captain Zhang said. "You think it'll make a difference?" "I think it already is," Ethan replied. "The recruits see them as a warning and as proof that change is possible." His father chuckled softly. "You've done good, son. I'm proud of you." As Ethan hung up, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The road ahead was still long, but progress was being made. Looking out the window of his office, Ethan spotted a patrol car parked near a local park. 2 officers were helping a group of kids set up a basketball hoop, their body cameras blinking red to show they were recording. Nearby, parents watched with cautious smiles, the walls of mistrust slowly crumbling. Ethan smiled. For the first time in years, he felt hope, not just for himself, but for the entire city. 6 months after that fateful winter night, the changes in Northpoint were undeniable. The reform policies Ethan Zhang had fought for were not only reshaping the police department, but also transforming the relationship between law enforcement and the community. The city felt different. There was less tension in the air, fewer murmurs of fear when a patrol car cruised by. Officers, once seen as adversaries by many, now attended community events, played basketball with kids at local parks, and helped elderly residents carry groceries. Body cameras, once a contentious point, had become a trusted safeguard for both officers and citizens, ensuring transparency in every interaction. Ethan had spent months overseeing these transformations, but today was a special day. For the first time since the reforms were enacted, a new class of recruits was graduating from the police academy. These officers were the first to train under the revamped system, and their presence symbolized the new era Ethan had envisioned. The academy's graduation hall buzzed with excitement. Proud families filled the seats, their faces glowing with pride as they watched their loved ones prepare to take the oath. The recruits themselves looked sharp in their freshly pressed uniforms, their eyes alight with determination and a hint of nervousness. Ethan stood at the podium at the front of the hall, reviewing his notes for the speech he would deliver. Sitting in the audience were some familiar faces: Chief Sims, who had eventually become a vocal advocate for the reforms; Mary, who had worked tirelessly by Ethan's side; and even his father, Captain Zhang, wearing his old police uniform for the occasion. To Ethan's surprise, two more familiar figures were seated in the front row: former officers Cooper and Harris. The two men had embraced their new roles as trainers at the academy, sharing their stories of misconduct and redemption with recruits as cautionary tales. It had been a controversial decision to bring them on board, but their willingness to own their mistakes and use them to teach others had earned them grudging respect from the community. Ethan glanced at the recruits seated before him. This class was different from any he'd seen before. There were more women, more minorities, and more people with backgrounds in community service. Each recruit had spent weeks volunteering at shelters, youth centers, and senior homes before even beginning their formal police training. He stepped up to the microphone, the room falling silent as all eyes turned toward him. "Good morning," Ethan began, his voice steady but warm. "Today is a day of celebration, not just for you, the graduates, but for our entire city." He paused, letting his words settle. "6 months ago, I stood on a frozen street, humbled and humiliated. That moment was a turning point, not just for me, but for Northpoint. It reminded me of why accountability, integrity, and compassion are essential in law enforcement." Ethan's gaze swept the room, his tone growing more resolute. "You, the graduating class, are the first to train under our new system. You represent the future of policing in this city. A future where officers aren't just enforcers of the law, but partners in building a safer, more united community." He gestured toward the audience. "Look around you. These aren't just your fellow recruits. They're your conscience, your accountability, and your strength. Together, you will redefine what it means to wear a badge." As Ethan continued, he highlighted the importance of the reforms. He spoke about the mandatory body cameras, the de-escalation training, and the civilian oversight board, all designed to ensure that officers could serve their community with honor and empathy. "The badge you're about to receive isn't a symbol of power," Ethan said. "It's a symbol of trust. And trust is something you must earn every single day." In the audience, Cooper and Harris exchanged a glance. They understood better than most the weight of those words. Ethan concluded his speech with a challenge to the recruits. "When you leave here today, remember this. True power isn't about control or fear. True power is about how many lives you can improve, how many people you can help, and how much trust you can build. That is the legacy you will leave behind." After the ceremony, each graduate stepped forward to receive their badge. Unlike previous years, this ceremony included a new tradition. Each officer was paired with a civilian advisor who would work alongside them during their first year on the force. Ethan watched with pride as the recruits shook hands with their advisors, their smiles bright and genuine. This partnership was another step toward bridging the divide between law enforcement and the community. As the ceremony ended, families flooded the floor, embracing the new officers and taking photos. Ethan stood to the side, observing the joyful scene. Cooper approached him, his expression hesitant but sincere. "Mr. Zhang," he began, "I just wanted to thank you for giving me and Harris a second chance." Ethan shook his hand firmly. "You earned it, and the work you're doing now is making a difference." Cooper nodded, his face a mixture of relief and determination. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm proud of the officers these recruits are becoming. They're going to change the way this city sees us." "I believe they will," Ethan replied. As the hall emptied, Ethan's father approached, his polished badge gleaming on his chest. "You've come a long way, son," Captain Zhang said, his voice filled with pride. "I never thought I'd live to see the day when policing looked like this." Ethan smiled, the weight of the past 6 months momentarily lifting. "It's only the beginning, Dad. There's still so much work to do." "That's the spirit," his father replied, clapping him on the shoulder. Ethan left the academy that afternoon with a renewed sense of purpose. As he drove past the streets where his journey had begun, he noticed the subtle but profound changes in the city. Children playing without fear, officers chatting with shop owners, and a community slowly beginning to heal. A new chapter had begun for Northpoint, and Ethan Zhang was determined to see it through. Ethan Zhang had never been one to dwell on victories, no matter how significant. For him, every success was a step forward, not a destination. 6 months into the reform era, Northpoint was undeniably different, but Ethan knew the work had only just begun. One of the most visible signs of change stood at the corner of Pine and 5th Streets, the very intersection where Ethan had been forced to do push-ups in the snow. A new community police center had been built there, its glass facade reflecting the city's skyline. Inside, officers and citizens gathered daily, working together on neighborhood initiatives, from organizing safety patrols to hosting workshops on de-escalation and conflict resolution. Ethan visited the center frequently. He often walked the halls, shaking hands with officers and chatting with residents. On this particular day, the building buzzed with activity as officers and community leaders planned an upcoming charity drive for families in need. "Good morning, Mr. Zhang." A young officer greeted as Ethan stepped into the main lobby. Her name was Officer Riley, one of the recent academy graduates. Her enthusiasm and professionalism were exactly what Ethan had envisioned for the new generation of officers. "Good morning, Riley," Ethan replied with a smile. "How's the team doing?" "Busy, but motivated," she said, gesturing toward a group of officers assembling donation boxes. "It feels good to be part of something positive." Ethan nodded, the sense of pride swelling in his chest. Moments like this reminded him why the fight for reform had been worth every sleepless night. In one of the community rooms, a group of citizens gathered for a monthly town hall meeting. These meetings, now a staple of Northpoint's approach to policing, provided a forum for residents to voice their concerns and collaborate directly with officers. Today's discussion centered on traffic enforcement policies, a topic that struck a personal chord for Ethan. He listened intently as residents shared their thoughts, taking detailed notes on his tablet. "Mr. Zhang," one elderly man said, raising his hand, "I just want to say, it's been years since I've felt comfortable talking to a police officer. But now, I see them walking the streets, helping people. It's a big change, and it's because of what you've done." Ethan smiled warmly. "Thank you, sir. But the credit belongs to everyone in this room. Change happens when we all work together." The man nodded, and the room broke into quiet applause. As the meeting wrapped up, Ethan stepped outside, where the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the city. The crisp winter air had given way to the milder days of spring, and the streets buzzed with life. He spotted a patrol car parked nearby, with 2 officers chatting with a group of teenagers. One of the teens was sitting in the driver's seat, grinning as an officer showed him how to use the car's radio. The scene was a stark contrast to the tense interactions Ethan had once witnessed between police and young people in Northpoint. Nearby, Ethan noticed a familiar figure, Cooper. The former officer had become a regular presence at the community police center, dedicating his time to mentoring both new recruits and troubled youth. Today, he stood beside a young man who looked to be about 16, his posture relaxed but attentive. "Ethan," Cooper called, waving him over. "Good to see you, Cooper," Ethan replied as he approached. He nodded toward the teenager. "Who's this?" "This is Jordan," Cooper said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We've been working together for a few weeks now. He's got a lot of potential, just needs someone to believe in him." Jordan gave Ethan a shy smile. "That's great to hear," Ethan said, addressing the boy. "Northpoint needs young leaders like you." Jordan straightened, his expression brightening. Thank you, sir. Later that evening, Ethan returned to City Hall, where his assistant Mary waited with a stack of reports. These just came in, she said, handing him a folder. Crime rates are down 20% since the reform started, and civilian complaints have dropped by 65%. Also, trust ratings for the police department are the highest they've been in over a decade. Ethan flipped through the reports, the statistics confirming what he'd seen firsthand in the community. These are incredible numbers, Mary. It's proof that we're heading in the right direction. Mary smiled. There's one more thing. A city in the neighboring state wants to adopt our reform model. They've requested your input to help them get started. Ethan leaned back in his chair, absorbing the news. The idea that Northpoint's changes were inspiring other cities filled him with a deep sense of purpose. Set up the meeting, he said. If they're serious about change, I'll do whatever I can to help. As the evening stretched on, Ethan found himself alone in his office, the city's lights twinkling through the window. His phone buzzed with a new message from his father. Proud of you, son. Keep pushing. Ethan stared at the message for a moment, then typed a quick reply. Thanks, Dad. This is just the beginning. He glanced at the corner of his desk where his council badge rested. Beside it was a photograph of the community police center, its windows glowing warmly in the night. The center had become a symbol of what was possible when people came together to rebuild trust, one step at a time. Ethan allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The journey hadn't been easy, and the fight for justice and accountability was far from over. But looking back on how far Northpoint had come, he knew it had all been worth it. Sometimes change started with small acts, a town hall meeting, a community workshop, or even 30 push-ups in the snow. And sometimes those small acts could change the world. The warmth of summer had settled over Northpoint, and with it came a renewed sense of optimism. 6 months ago, Ethan Zhang had stood in the snow, humiliated and shivering, forced to do push-ups by 2 rogue officers. Today, he stood on the steps of the community police center, a symbol of the city's transformation, addressing a crowd gathered to celebrate another milestone. 6 months ago, Ethan began, his voice strong and clear. We were faced with a choice: to continue down the path of mistrust and division, or to take bold steps toward reform and unity. Northpoint chose the latter, and today we see the results of that decision. The crowd applauded, their faces reflecting pride and hope. Among them were officers and citizens alike, standing shoulder to shoulder, a testament to the bridges that had been rebuilt. Ethan gestured toward the graduates of the latest police academy class, standing in crisp uniforms at the front of the crowd. These young men and women represent the future of our city, he said. They've trained not only in law enforcement, but also in compassion, accountability, and community engagement. They are the embodiment of what policing should be. Behind the graduates stood Cooper and Harris, who had become key figures in the Academy's training program. Their presence served as a reminder of the importance of redemption and the power of change. As the ceremony concluded, Ethan mingled with the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging words of encouragement. He spoke with parents, community leaders, and even teenagers who had once distrusted the police, but now expressed hope for a better relationship. One young girl approached him, clutching a small notepad. "Mr. Zhang," she said shyly, "I'm writing an essay for school about heroes, and I want to write about you." Ethan crouched to her level, a warm smile spreading across his face. "That's very kind of you," he said. "But remember, a hero isn't someone who works alone. It's someone who brings people together to make a difference. That's what we've done here as a community." The girl nodded thoughtfully before scribbling something in her notebook. As Ethan stood, he caught sight of his father standing at the edge of the crowd. Captain Zhang looked every bit the proud patriarch, his arms crossed over his chest and a small smile on his weathered face. Ethan excused himself and walked over. "Well, Dad," Ethan said, "what do you think?" His father chuckled. "You've done good, son. Better than I could have imagined. You've turned a humiliation into a movement. Not many people can say that." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat, but quickly swallowed it down. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot coming from you." The two men stood in silence for a moment, watching as the crowd began to disperse. Families took photos with the new officers, while others explored the community police center, now a hub for collaboration and education. Later that evening, Ethan found himself back at his office, reviewing a new batch of reports. The numbers continued to reflect the success of the reforms. Complaints had dropped by 70%, and community trust in the police had risen by 65%. Other cities had begun adopting Northpoint's model, and Ethan had been invited to speak at national conferences on police reform. But it wasn't the numbers that mattered most to him. It was the stories. Stories like that of Jordan, the young man Cooper had been mentoring, who was now excelling in school and considering a career in public service. Or stories of officers like Riley, who had become a beloved figure in her neighborhood, known for her kindness and dedication. Ethan leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a moment of satisfaction. But his work was far from over. The following week, Ethan stood before the city council once again, presenting the next phase of his reform plan. This time, the focus was on expanding mental health resources for both officers and citizens. He proposed a partnership with local organizations to ensure that officers had the tools to handle complex situations without resorting to force. "We've come a long way," Ethan told the council, "but we can't stop now. Real change is a continuous process, and we owe it to our community to keep moving forward." The proposal passed unanimously, and Ethan left the chamber feeling a renewed sense of purpose. On the anniversary of that cold winter night, Ethan returned to the corner of Pine and Fifth. The community police center stood as a beacon of hope, its lights glowing warmly against the evening sky. Inside, officers and residents gathered for an open house event. Ethan joined a group of children who were exploring a police cruiser, their laughter echoing through the room. As the event wound down, Ethan stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The air was cool, but not nearly as biting as it had been that night. He gazed at the spot where he had knelt in the snow, remembering the pain and humiliation he had felt. But now, those feelings were replaced with something far more powerful. Pride. Pride in what the city had accomplished, in the resilience of its people, and in the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths to create a better future. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Zhang?" Ethan turned to see Riley, the young officer he had spoken with at the community police center months ago. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "None of this would have happened without your leadership." Ethan smiled. "It wasn't just me, Riley. It was all of us." As Riley walked back inside, Ethan lingered for a moment longer. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, but they no longer felt oppressive. Instead, they were a reminder that even the darkest nights could lead to brighter days. Ethan took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, but he was ready. Sometimes, he thought, change starts with the smallest acts. 30 push-ups in the snow had been his beginning. And from that humble start, a movement had grown, one that would ripple far beyond Northpoint, leaving a legacy that would endure for generations. With that thought, Ethan turned and walked back toward the glowing lights of the community police center, his steps steady and sure. The story of Ethan Zhang's journey from humiliation to transformative leadership serves as a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of change, even in the most entrenched systems. At its core, this tale isn't just about one man's fight for justice. It's about the collective power of accountability, compassion, and collaboration. Ethan's experience illuminated the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of addressing systemic failures head-on. It showed us that real change requires courage, both the courage to confront injustice and the courage to rebuild trust from the ground up. The reforms in Northpoint didn't happen overnight, nor were they the work of one individual. They were the result of a community coming together to demand better, and a leader who refused to settle for less. This story reminds us that moments of hardship can become the catalyst for profound transformation. It teaches us that redemption is possible, not just for individuals like Cooper and Harris, but for entire systems. When people are willing to reflect on their mistakes and strive for better, even the deepest wounds can begin to heal. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is the power of small actions. Whether it's a single push-up in the snow, a heartfelt apology, or a commitment to listen and learn, These moments can ripple outward, creating waves of change far greater than anyone could imagine. Ethan Zhang's legacy reminds us that while justice may be hard-won, it is always worth pursuing. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. And don't stop there. Share your own stories with us. Have you experienced or witnessed moments of transformation, resilience, or justice? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the powerful and meaningful stories we'll share next. Join the conversation and let us know your thoughts. Your voice matters.